In many human societies, there is a deep suspicion toward power that concentrates itself openly. People tend to distrust rulers who appear comfortable, visible, and unchallenged. At the same time, there is often a strong tolerance for power that hides behind moral language. When authority presents itself as protection, generosity, or justice, it becomes harder to examine. This creates a recurring human pattern. Power that frames itself as resistance often escapes the scrutiny applied to power that governs. If harm is done in the name of order, it is questioned. If harm is done in the name of fairness, it is often forgiven before it is measured. In these systems, morality does not remove power, it masks it. People living under pressure rarely ask who benefits most from a system that claims to correct injustice. They ask instead whether the system feels relieving in the moment. Relief becomes proof. Intent becomes evidence. Long-term structure fades from view. This is where certain figures thrive. Not because they are dishonest, but because the environment rewards a specific kind of honesty. Honesty that speaks upward, not inward. Honesty that criticizes others while remaining unexamined itself. This pattern repeats across history, myth, and folklore. Robin Hood's behavior makes sense inside the world he inhabits. Power is already concentrated. Law already favors those who control wealth. Punishment already flows downward. In that environment, his actions do not appear radical. They appear corrective. He does not attack the idea of hierarchy. He accepts that hierarchy exists. What he challenges is how it behaves in practice. He intervenes where excess becomes visible. He targets wealth that feels unjust, not wealth as such. This distinction matters because it keeps his actions legible to everyone watching. Robin Hood does not take randomly. He takes from figures who already represent authority. Sheriffs, collectors, officials, agents of the crown. This creates immediate clarity. His violence, when it occurs, feels directed rather than chaotic. His theft feels selective rather than greedy. Because of this, his behavior produces relief without demanding reflection. People do not need to understand systems to understand outcomes. They see food arrive, debts lifted, fear temporarily reduced. The effect is direct and personal. Within this pattern, Robin Hood becomes a figure of trust, not because he is accountable, but because his interests appear aligned with those below him. He does not ask for obedience. He earns loyalty through redistribution and protection. Loyalty feels voluntary, even when it becomes expected. His group forms around him naturally, not through ideology, but through dependency. Those who benefit remain close. Those who are protected stay loyal. Over time, this loyalty stabilizes into structure, even if it is not maimed as such. Importantly, Robin Hood does not present himself as a ruler. He avoids symbols of governance. No throne, no court, no lawmaking. This absence reinforces the idea that he is not replacing power, only correcting it. His authority hides inside familiarity. Nothing in this pattern feels contradictory. His leadership works because it stays close to immediate needs. His morality feels obvious because it produces visible relief. His violence feels justified because it targets figures already disliked. At this stage, the system around him adjusts. People wait for intervention rather than confrontation. They hope for correction rather than change. Robin Hood becomes part of the environment, a known variable in an otherwise hostile system. The pattern holds. The behavior remains coherent. No pressure has arrived yet. Structural tension appears when the environment begins to change while Robin Hood does not. At first, this change is subtle. The inequalities that justified his actions do not disappear, but they shift. Authority adapts. Power becomes more cautious, more distributed, less visibly excessive. Officials learn. Taxes are collected with more distance. Wealth is moved in less obvious ways. The figures Robin Hood once targeted become harder to identify clearly. Excess no longer announces itself as openly as before. This matters because Robin Hood's legitimacy depends on clarity. His actions require visible injustice. When injustice becomes procedural rather than theatrical, intervention becomes harder to justify without explanation. His role was never designed for complexity, it was designed for correction. At the same time, his presence alters expectations. Those he protects begin to rely on him not just as relief, but as assurance. Intervention becomes anticipated, risk is postponed, responsibility slowly shifts away from individuals and toward the figure who has proven he will step in. This creates a quiet dependency. Robin Hood does not notice this immediately. From his perspective, he is still doing what he has always done. He intervenes when excess appears, he protects when punishment feels unfair. His internal logic remains consistent. But the environment is no longer static. Authority begins to respond not just to inequality, but to him. Systems adjust around his presence. They become less blunt, more evasive. Power learns to avoid becoming a target. As this happens, Robin Hood's actions begin to require more force to produce the same relief. Smaller interventions no longer shift outcomes. Redistribution must be larger, more frequent, more visible to maintain trust. What was once corrective begins to feel performative. This is the tension, not between good and evil, but between visibility and sustainability. His group also grows. More people seek protection, more people depend on his intervention. Coordination becomes harder. Decisions affect more lives. Mistakes carry wider consequences. Yet there is no formal structure to absorb this complexity. Loyalty replaces governance. Trust replaces accountability. Robin Hood is still seen as a correction, not a ruler, but the scale of his influence begins to resemble rule. Expectations rise, pressure accumulates. The environment no longer resets cleanly after each intervention. What once felt like balance starts to feel fragile. Robin Hood does not become more ambitious, he becomes more necessary. And necessity changes the shape of power long before anyone names it. Machiavelli is useful here because he does not ask whether power is justified. He asks how it survives. He observes what happens when authority is challenged, redistributed, or disguised. From this perspective, Robin Hood's position becomes clearer and more complicated. Robin Hood does not hold formal power. He does not govern territory openly. He does not issue laws or demand taxes. But Machiavelli would not stop there. He would ask a different question. Who decides when force is used? Who decides where resources move? Who absorbs risk and who avoids it? By that measure, Robin Hood holds real power. His power is informal, but it is not weak. It operates through timing, surprise, and narrative. He chooses when to appear and when to disappear. He controls information by controlling visibility. His actions are known, but his plans are not. This asymmetry protects him. Machiavelli would immediately recognize the advantage here. A ruler who cannot be predicted is difficult to neutralize. A force that appears only at moments of excess keeps authority reactive rather than proactive. Power is forced to respond instead of consolidate. At the same time, Robin Hood's legitimacy rests on perception. He must be seen as correcting injustice, not competing for control. This is a narrow path. If he appears too organized, he resembles a rival authority. If he appears too violent, he loses moral cover. His power survives only as long as it is framed as resistance, not rule. This framing is strategic, even if it is not consciously designed. Robin Hood benefits from what Machiavelli would call borrowed legitimacy. He draws authority from the failures of others. Every unjust tax, every harsh punishment, every visible excess strengthens his position without him needing to justify himself. His power grows as official power discredits itself. But this creates dependence on the very system he opposes. If authority becomes subtler, more procedural, less visibly cruel, Robin Hood's interventions lose clarity. He cannot easily oppose processes. He can only oppose acts. Machiavelli would note another vulnerability. Robin Hood does not manage succession. His authority is personal, not institutional. Loyalty is tied to him, not to rules or offices. This makes his power strong in the present, but fragile over time. If he is absent, injured, or removed, there is no structure to continue his role. Relief collapses back into fear. Dependents are exposed. Power rushes back into the vacuum. Machiavelli would see this as a critical flaw. At the same time, Robin Hood's refusal to formalize his authority protects him. By avoiding governance, he avoids responsibility for long-term outcomes. He can withdraw when pressure rises. He can relocate when conditions shift. This flexibility keeps him alive. From a Machiavellian view, Robin Hood exists in a state of permanent tactical advantage and permanent strategic risk. He wins encounters but cannot stabilize systems. He weakens authority without replacing it. This creates cycles of disruption rather than resolution. This is not hypocrisy, it is structural. Robin Hood's power works because it is intermittent, because it is visible but not accountable, because it operates in moments rather than across time. Machiavelli would not condemn this. He would simply observe that such power always invites escalation. As authority adapts, Robin Hood must act more boldly to remain effective. As he acts more boldly, he becomes more visible. As he becomes more visible, he invites containment. The balance narrows. Machiavelli would recognize the trap immediately. Power that refuses to govern eventually forces others to govern against it. Robin Hood remains internally consistent. The environment no longer is. Jung becomes relevant when a role begins to exceed the person carrying it. His focus is not on good or bad behavior, but on psychological cost. He asks what parts of the self are denied in order to remain functional inside a given structure. With Robin Hood, this cost is easy to miss because his role is socially approved. Robin Hood is allowed to be who he is. In fact, he is encouraged to be that way. He is brave, generous, decisive, and defiant. These traits are rewarded by loyalty and admiration. They form a coherent identity. But Jung would ask a quieter question. What parts of Robin Hood are never permitted to appear? From the beginning, Robin Hood must suppress doubt. His actions affect many people. Redistribution creates winners and losers. Protection creates dependency. Violence creates risk. But uncertainty cannot be expressed openly. A leader built on reassurance cannot afford visible hesitation. So hesitation moves inward. Over time, Robin Hood becomes identified almost entirely with the role of correction. He is not simply a man who intervenes, he becomes the intervention. This narrows the self. Other aspects of identity, fear, fatigue, regret, reflection, are pushed aside because they interfere with decisiveness. Jung would describe this as a one-sided personality, a psyche optimized for action but underdeveloped in integration. The shadow begins to form here, not as cruelty but as unacknowledged consequence. Robin Hood does not deny that harm occurs, he simply does not dwell on it. Those harmed by his actions are categorized as acceptable losses. Officials injured or killed are framed as symbols rather than people. This framing protects him from internal conflict. But what is framed away does not disappear, it accumulates. As pressure increases, Robin Hood must act more frequently and more forcefully. Each action reinforces the role and weakens the boundary between self and symbol. He is no longer just acting out of conviction, he is acting to preserve coherence. To stop would be to face everything he has deferred. Jung would note that this creates rigidity. When identity becomes too aligned with a single function, flexibility is lost. Robin Hood cannot easily adapt to environments where intervention is ambiguous. He is built for clear injustice, not for subtle harm. When harm becomes procedural, his instincts fail him. This failure produces internal tension, not confusion but irritation. The world stops responding cleanly, outcomes become unpredictable, loyalty thins, relief is delayed. These signals are not processed consciously, they are felt as resistance. The shadow grows stronger here. The traits Robin Hood disowns, control, dominance, coercion, begin to leak into his behavior. He may insist more strongly. He may demand loyalty rather than earn it. He may justify harsher actions as necessary. From the outside, this looks like escalation. From the inside, it feels like survival. Jung would emphasize that this is not corruption, it is compensation. Robin Hood has never integrated the possibility that his role itself creates harm. That idea threatens the entire structure of his identity. So the psyche defends itself by externalizing blame. Authority is always worse. Circumstances are always unfair. Pressure is always imposed from outside. This keeps the self intact, but at a cost. The cost is fragmentation. Robin Hood remains effective in action, but increasingly distant from reflection. His inner world simplifies. Complexity becomes an enemy. Ambiguity becomes intolerable. He must act, not because action is always right, but because stillness would force reckoning. Jung would see this as a psychological narrowing caused by prolonged identification with a heroic role. The hero becomes trapped by the image that once empowered him. He cannot step outside it without losing coherence. Robin Hood is not internally collapsing. He is internally compressed. And compressed systems do not break loudly. They harden. Nietzsche enters when values stop feeling stable. He is not interested in whether values sound noble. He asks where they come from, what conditions support them, and whether they can survive pressure. When applied to Robin Hood, this lens shifts the focus away from intention and toward endurance. Robin Hood's values are easy to name: fairness, protection of the weak, resistance to unjust authority. These values feel self-evident because they respond to visible harm. They arise naturally in a world where power is crude and suffering is obvious. Nietzsche would immediately ask an uncomfortable question: are these values strong or are they sheltered? For most of his story, Robin Hood's values are never truly tested. The environment favors them. Authority behaves badly enough to justify intervention. Victims are clear. Enemies are recognizable. Under these conditions, values do not compete. They align. But Nietzsche is interested in what happens when alignment disappears. As the environment changes, injustice becomes less visible. Power becomes procedural. Harm is spread thinly rather than delivered openly. In this new context, Robin Hood's values lose clarity. Fairness becomes harder to define. Protection becomes selective. Resistance risks becoming disruption. This is where Nietzsche would say the test begins. Robin Hood's values were shaped by reaction. They exist in opposition to excess. They are defined by what they resist rather than by what they build. As long as excess is obvious, this works. When excess becomes subtle, reactive values struggle. Robin Hood responds by intensifying his commitment. He does not revise his values, he reasserts them. This is a common human response. When values stop producing the same results, people often cling to them more tightly instead of questioning their limits. Nietzsche would call this a defensive move, not a moral failure, but a sign that values are under strain. Robin Hood's fairness begins to rely more on his judgment than on shared understanding. What counts as excess is decided by him. Who deserves redistribution is decided by him. What level of force is acceptable is decided by him. His values become personalized. This is a dangerous shift. Nietzsche was deeply suspicious of values that present themselves as universal while depending on specific individuals to enforce them. He would argue that such values are not universal at all. They are expressions of power wearing moral language. This does not mean Robin Hood is lying. It means his values are no longer anchored in conditions that support them naturally. They require enforcement. As pressure continues, another change occurs. The people around Robin Hood begin to value stability more than correction. Predictability becomes more important than relief. Coordination becomes more valuable than disruption. New values emerge, not because they are morally superior, but because they function better under strain. Nietzsche would observe this without sentiment. Values that organize survival replace values that once inspired resistance. This is not betrayal, it is adaptation. Robin Hood feels this shift as alienation. His values no longer dominate the environment. They are questioned, delayed, or quietly bypassed. From his perspective, people have become cautious, compromised, or weak. From Nietzsche's perspective, the environment has simply become honest. Values that thrived under certain conditions are now being asked to perform under different ones. Robin Hood's values do not collapse completely. They persist, but they lose authority. They stop shaping the system as a whole and begin to exist in pockets, among loyal followers, in stories, in memory. Nietzsche would say this is the fate of values that cannot transform themselves. They become moral heritage rather than living force. They are respected but no longer decisive. At this point, Robin Hood faces a narrowing similar to what Nietzsche describes in many of his figures. Either values evolve to meet new conditions, or they retreat into purity and isolation. Robin Hood's values resist evolution because evolution would require compromise with systems he was defined against. So they harden. They become more absolute, less flexible, and more dependent on opposition. Without clear enemies, they lose direction. Without visible injustice, they lose urgency. Nietzsche would not condemn Robin Hood for this. He would simply note that values born in resistance often struggle to survive success. Once the world changes in response to them, they no longer recognize the terrain. Robin Hood does not abandon his values. The world outgrows the conditions that made them dominant. What remains is tension, not between right and wrong, but between history and pressure. After the shift, the story stops behaving like a story of resistance. It becomes procedural. Actions continue, but they no longer carry the same meaning. Each intervention feels less decisive. Each outcome feels temporary. The sense of forward movement dissolves. Robin Hood is still present, he still acts, he still intervenes, but the environment no longer organizes itself around his actions. Authority adapts in advance. Communities adjust their expectations. People prepare for uncertainty rather than waiting for correction. This changes how events unfold. Encounters feel smaller, successes feel quieter, losses linger longer. When Robin Hood redistributes wealth, the relief is partial. When he disrupts authority, the response is delayed rather than dramatic. The system absorbs shocks without visibly breaking. Narratively, this produces ambiguity. There is no clear victory and no clear defeat. Instead, there is repetition with diminishing impact. Robin Hood's actions manage situations rather than resolve them. He is no longer shaping the arc, he is reacting to it. The people around him sense this before he does. They become cautious, they diversify their loyalties, they accept help without assuming protection will return. Gratitude becomes quieter, trust becomes conditional. None of this is spoken openly. Robin Hood experiences this as distance. The world feels less responsive. Outcomes feel less aligned with effort. He may interpret this as fatigue, fear, or betrayal, but structurally, it is neither. It is recalibration. The narrative no longer centers him automatically. This decentering is subtle. There is no moment where Robin Hood is rejected. There is no confrontation where his role is declared obsolete. Instead, the story continues around him. Roads remain open without his presence. Authority functions without visibly provoking him. People adapt. He still matters, but he no longer defines the situation. From this point on, the story loses clarity. Cause and effect blur. Moral language becomes less convincing. Intervention feels heavier. Each action carries more uncertainty than relief. The future no longer bends easily around intention. Robin Hood does not transform here. He persists. Persistence replaces momentum. This is what narratives look like when systems move beyond the conditions that once made a figure central. The figure remains recognizable, the behavior remains familiar, but relevance thins. There is no ending implied, only continuation. The story does not ask whether Robin Hood was right or wrong. It simply shows what happens when a corrective force outlives the environment that made it necessary. In human systems, figures who correct injustice are often trusted more easily than those who govern. Their authority feels lighter because it arrives as intervention, not administration. They act where harm is visible and then withdraw. This creates relief without demanding long-term commitment. But relief has limits. It depends on clarity, it depends on timing, and it depends on the surrounding system continuing to fail in recognizable ways. When those conditions change, correction does not disappear, but it loses its central position. What once felt necessary begins to feel intermittent. This does not mean the corrective figure was wrong. It means the environment no longer organizes itself around that role. As systems adapt, they absorb disruption differently. They become quieter, more procedural, less responsive to symbolic acts. At that point, power is no longer challenged by opposition alone. It is reshaped by structure. Figures like Robin Hood remain compelling because they represent a moment when injustice could still be interrupted visibly, when action felt proportionate to harm, when values aligned cleanly with outcomes. But those moments are not permanent. They are conditional. When conditions shift, persistence becomes ambiguity. Intervention becomes friction. Familiar behavior continues, but its effects change. Nothing resolves this tension cleanly. There is no moral reversal and no final judgment. There is only the record of how systems move on, even when the figures within them remain the same. Until the next observation.